Miguel's call had triggered protocols, but when silences were dead buried, when truth emerges from hidden program was officially terminated, the world remembers that honor never really dies. It just waits patiently for the right moment, even when the organizations that created legends walk among classified archives. Teaching Miguel, I'll be there, not documentation. Subscribe to True Veteran Stories. Just a promise made in quiet legacies still carry weight. But here's not just on story takes but on an unexpected turn. Because what Aline didn't know was that she wasn't the only ghost. At Forward Operating Base Sandstone that day, the flight operations at Forward Operating Base Sandstone pulsed with its typical Tuesday intensity. Chinook rotors winning toward takeoff, MPs shouting over the grinding of equipment truck, the sharp scent-off fuel mixing with dessert grit, and the distant aroma of coffee from the operations tent. Elena Vask sat on the scorched equipment container, her gear bag beside her feet, the sentry's rejection still a-chewing in the air, her standard jagged to her body soaked with perspiration as the senior MP reinforced his position with a firm shake of his head. No, Space Sergeant, next rotation tomorrow. The two officers who ridiculed here earlier trotted past their crisp uniforms, earning them acknowledgement from the guards, while Elena's ankle throbbed, more noticeably under the heat stress, a quiet reminder of the blast that had nearly claimed her. The crew dismissed her urgent request, reduced to a crumpled message in the younger guard's clipboard. Here positioned her gear bag, the weight pulling at her shoulder where fragments had left a ragged scar concealed beneath the fabric. The lieutenant's mockery persisted as they lingered nearby. Bet she's never seen real combat, Chen said, voice carrying over the rotor sound, probably a desk warrior playing soldier. Rodriguez added a blocked the mouth her thoughts, returning to the Kandahar evening, where that injury had earned her amble noon could wear. Cher remembered that night with crystalline clarity. The taste of copper in her mouth from biting her tongue during the explosion, the smell of burning flesh and metal, the screams of wounded soldiers echoing across the desert floor. Desert Phoenix had been called in to extract our reconnaissance team that had stumbled into a Taliban stronghold. 12 American soldiers strapped in a compound, surrounded by enemies who knew the terrain better than any GPS system could map. Elena had been the door gunner on the lead bird, providing covering fire, while the extraction rappelled into hell. The flight operations continued, radio crackling, boots scrapings, but the atmosphere felt more oppressive. With each insult, the Nasho moved ignition servicing a nearby. Apache stopped, his eyes catching the edge of her collarless head, adjusted her jack. Technical Sergeant Davis recognized something in that faded emblem, something that made his hands shake. Asher turned to his work. Elena barely noticed. Their attention focused on the Chinook's pre-flight procedures. The lieutenants, joined by Martinez, escalated their taunts, probably bought that gear from a surplus store. Martinez said, leaning against a crate. Noun at patch, not credentials, just a pretender. Their laugh attracted a small gathering of crew and guards feeding off the security of rank. What none of them realized was that their voices were carrying further than they thought, and someone with the authority to change everything had been listening from the command post's observation deck. That's when the flight operations rhythm faltered. A figure emerged from the command center, his uniform pressed silver stars gleaming in the brutal light. Brigadier General David Kane moved with the purposeful stride of a man who'd accumulated years in combat zone, his weathered faces scanning the situation. Kane was 48 years old, a career soldier who'd risen through the ranks on merit and blood. He'd commanded units in Iraq, Afghanistan, and places that didn't appear on any official map. The lieutenants straightened their smirks, disappearing. Kane's eyes narrowed as Elena shifted to stand, her jacket moving to reveal a small Velcro emblem on her collar. Desert Tana Crimson Eagle with a lightning bolt beneath it, faded but unmistakable. The crowd stilled, the air thickening with unspoken significance. Kane stepped closer, his voice cutting through the noise. Hold position, he said, his stone carrying the authority of command. The MP paused, the lieutenants froze, and Elena turned, her expression unreadable. Kane's gaze locked on the emblem, his jaw clenching. That symbol, he said almost to himself, Desert Fan. IX-08 Kandahar. The flight operation held its breath, the dust seeming to settle. Ash's story loomed large. But what happened next would change everything, because General didn't just recognize the patch. He had been there that night in Kandahar when everything went wrong, and he owed his life to the woman standing before him. The flight operations at Forward Operating Base Sandstone stood frozen in tense silence, the desert sun blazing down, as Brigadier General David Kane fixed his attention on the faded emblem. On Elena Vasquez's collar, a crimson eagle with a lightning bolt, its descent threads, speaking of on it that never officially existed. The lieutenants Martinez, Rodriguez, and Chen stiffened their earlier mockery, evaporating like vapor under the heat. MPs and crew members froze mid-action, radios falling silent, the Chinook's rotor whine fading into the background. Elena straightened her gear bag, still beside her feet, their expression a mixture of determination and quiet dignity. Kane stepped closer, his voicey but laced with memory. Kandahar 08, he said, his eyes tracing the emblem's worn jazz. Desert Phoenix, extracted my platoon from an ambush, insurgents closing in a close air support. You were on that bird, Elena nodded once her measured door gunner covered the withdrawal while you evacuated the wounded. Kane's mind flashed back to that night, 18 months into his deployment, when he'd been a lieutenant. NT Colonel commanding a forward reconnaissance unit that had walked into a carefully orchestrated trap. The air thickened heavy with a history. The young officers couldn't grasp Kane's jaw, tightened his mind, flashing to the chaos 6 men wounded 18 trap, and a phantom team cutting an escape route through enemy lines. He remembered the sound of Elena's machine gun, chattering from the helicopter's door, the muzzle flashes illuminating her determined face, as she laid down suppressive fire that kept the Taliban from overrunning their position here. He remembered the way she'd ignored the bullets winning, past their head, focused only on keeping his soldiers alive long enough for the extraction to succeed. That Eagle murmured no records, no personnel files, just shadows, deep black operations. The flight operation shushed deepened the crowd, exchanging nervous glances. The lieutenants shifted their taunts, a distant memory. Kane remembered the after-action report he'd tried to write praising the helicopter crew that had saved his unit, their port that had been classified above his clearance level, the commendations that had disappeared into bureaucratic black holes, the names that had been scrubbed from officia. LR. Kane turned sharply, his voices leasing the air. "You need the flight commander now." An MP corporal sprinted toward the hangar, returning with Major Thompson, who saluted sharp. Sir Thompson was a competent officer, but he'd never served in units where the rules were suggestions, and survival was the only metric that mattered. Kane didn't was 2 words. "This is Staff Sergeant First Class Elena Vasquez, Desert Phoenix, Kandahar 08. She provided cover under black protocol, full authorization. Full access, get her on that Chinook, no questions, that's an order." Thompson's eyes flicked to the emblem, understanding dawning across his face. He'd heard whispers about Desert Phoenix, late-night conversations between senior officers who'd sworn oaths they couldn't break. "It's here," he snapped, motioning to the crew load here equipment. Now the lieutenants whispered among themselves. "Desert Phoenix." Martinez muttered, "Never heard of it." Thompson overheard, his tone cold enough to freeze deserts. "Saying you wouldn't classified beyond your clearance level. That unit saved more lives than you'll ever know, General." Elena's gear bag was rushed to the helicopter, the crew moving with renewed urgency. Morrison, the crew chief, personally supervised the loading, his earlier skepticism replaced by professional respect. Martinez approached, his head lowered. "You apologized, didn't know your background." Elena's gaze was steady, but not unkindled. "You didn't inquire," she said, the words a quiet lesson on humility, rather than rebuke. He nodded, humbled, understanding that he'd just learned something important about respect and assumptions. "I will next time, ma'am." She gave a slight nod, letting the moment register. Kane walked her to the ramp, the flight operations resuming its rhythm, but transformed forever. "Note a favor," he said quietly. "Obligation." Elena paused at the helicopter's edge, looked back at the general, who had recognized her worth even when the system hadn't. "Thank you, sir, for remembering." Kane's salute was sharp and respect. "Some things you never forget, Sergeant, especially debts that can never be paid." As she boarded the general's salute day gesture that rippled through the observers by nightfall, the story would read Elena the ghost with the hidden emblem. Gen confirmed, but also a reminder that heroes don't always wear their medals on their chests. The crew chief Morrison helped her secure her gear, his demeanor completely changed from the dismissive professional he'd been minutes earlier. "Ma'am, if you don't mind masking, what was it like serving with Desert Phoenix?" Elena considered the question carefully. "We did what needed to be done," she said simply, "when the official channels couldn't or wouldn't." Morrison nodded, understanding that some questions don't have easy answers. Some missions exist in the spaces between what's legal and what's necessary inside the Chinook. The familiar vibration of pre-flight surrounded her mind on Miguel Rodriguez waiting east with an abdominal wound. The aircraft lifted off, carrying her to a soldier who needed her, the emblem Massillon Tuath kept in the shadows. But this story isn't over yet, because when Elena arrived at that eastern compound, what she found would test everything she thought she knew about loyalty duty and the ghosts that haunt the shadows of war. As the helicopter climbed into the desert sky, Elena closed her eyes and let the memories wash over her. Kandahar 2008, the night that had changed everything, the night that had forged bonds stronger than blood and deeper than official recognition. She thought about Mig waiting for her, scared, and hurt, a place where official channels had failed him. Again, she thought about the system that had created soldiers like them and then abandoned them when the politics changed. She thought about the price of service and the weight of promises made in darkness. Want to know what happened when she reached Miguel, and why her arrival would spark a chain of events that would expose his secrets the military had buried for over a decade. Hit that notification bell, because the next chapter of this story will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about the hidden wars our soldiers fight in silence and the bonds that survive, even when the units that forged them disappear into classified archive. Sarah considered the offer carefully. For 3 years, She'd avoided anything that might draw attention to her past. She'd learned to be invisible, to let people underestimate. But looking at the faces around her, young rangers who'd gone from mockery to awe in the space of a few minutes, she realized that some knowledge was too valuable to keep hidden. "What did you have in mind?" she asked. "Advanced combat tactics, close quarters battle, the kind of real-world skills that can't be learned from manuals or simulations." Sarah nodded slowly. "I can do that." Rodriguez turned to the rangers who'd been observing the exchange. "You heard the lady. Form up for advanced training, and I suggest you pay very close attention to everything she tells you." As the rangers scrambled to organize themselves, Rodriguez leaned closer to Sarah. "Can I ask you something personal?" "You can ask. Do you regret it? The discharge, the loss of recognition, everything you gave up?" Sarah looked out across the training ground, watching young rangers prepare for instruction that might someday save their lives in situations they couldn't yet imagine. "I regret that good people died for bad reasons," she said quietly. "I regret that politics matter more than results. But I don't regret doing what was right, even when it cost me everything." Rodriguez nodded, understanding passing between them like shared classified information. Sarah picked up a training rifle, checking the action with movements that spoke of expertise that couldn't be faked or forgotten. "Let's hope they never have to use what I'm going to teach them," she said. "But if they do, they'll be ready." As she walked toward the assembled rangers, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in 3 years. Not vindication. That would require caring about the opinions of people who judged her unfairly. But purpose. The knowledge that her skills, her experience, her hard-won wisdom could still serve something larger than herself. The Phantom of Bagram was about to teach the next generation what real warfare looked like. Word spread through Camp Valdez faster than classified information through intelligence channels. Within hours, every soldier and officer on the base had heard some version of the story. The details varied with each telling, but the core truth remained constant. The Phantom of Bagram had walked among them, invisible and unrecognized, until a moment of casual mockery had revealed who she really was. The rangers who'd made jokes about military wannabes found themselves the subjects of base-wide discussion, not disciplinary action. Sarah had specifically requested that none be taken, but the kind of attention that made young soldiers examine their assumptions about who deserved respect. Sarah herself had settled into an unofficial role as advanced tactics instructor. Colonel Rodriguez had made the arrangement permanent within a week, citing the need for real-world expertise in training programs that had become too dependent on simulation. She worked with small groups, teaching skills that couldn't be found in any manual: how to read terrain under stress, how to make split-second decisions when lives hung in the balance, how to maintain accuracy when everything around you was chaos. The young rangers approached her training with a reverence that made Sarah uncomfortable at first. They hung on every word, took notes on techniques that she'd learned through trial and error in places that didn't appear on any official map. "Ma'am," one recruit asked during a close-quarters combat session, "how do you stay so calm under pressure?" Sarah considered the question while adjusting his stance. "Fear keeps you alive," she said finally, "but panic gets you killed. The difference is training until your responses become automatic." "Were you ever scared? In combat, I mean?" "Every time," Sarah replied without hesitation. "Anyone who says they weren't is either lying or didn't understand the situation." The honesty was refreshing to rangers who'd been fed a steady diet of bravado and machismo. Sarah's approach was clinical, precise, focused on survival rather than glory. Stories about her teaching methods began circulating through military networks beyond Camp Valdez. Veteran instructors requested transfers to observe her techniques. Senior officers made unannounced visits to training sessions, quietly taking notes on innovations that exceeded standard military doctrine. A small memorial plaque appeared near the training ground one morning, unofficial and unauthorized, but tolerated by base command. It bore no names or specific references, just a simple inscription: "Honor serves in silence." Nobody claimed responsibility for placing it there, but everyone understood its significance. It represented more than Sarah's story. It honored all the quiet professionals who served without recognition, who carried their achievements like hidden tattoos, visible only to those who knew how to look. Sarah noticed the plaque during one of her morning training sessions, but said nothing about it. She'd learned that some gestures were more powerful when left unacknowledged, that respect given freely was worth more than recognition demanded through official channels. The rangers she trained began carrying themselves differently, not with arrogance, but with quiet confidence that came from learning skills from someone who'd proven them in situations where failure meant death. They'd been taught by a legend, and it showed in everything they did. 8 months after that first encounter at the training ground, Sarah received an offer from the Pentagon: special advisor position, enhanced clearance, the chance to influence training programs across all service branches. She turned it down without explanation. Some legends were meant to remain in the shadow, teaching one soldier at a time. Some legacies don't need grand announcements. The faded tattoo that Sarah carried wasn't a trophy to be displayed or a credential to be flaunted. It was a reminder to herself and to anyone who discovered it that true service transcends the circumstances that define it. For 3 years, she'd lived as a phantom, invisible and forgotten by a system that had once depended on her skill. She'd accepted blame that wasn't hers, carried responsibility for failures that belonged to others, and disappeared into anonymity, because sometimes the greatest service you can provide is becoming invisible. But invisibility has its limits. When you've earned the right to wear that ink through selection processes that eliminate 19 out of 20 candidates, when you've made split-second decisions that saved lives and protected freedoms that others take for granted, when you've sacrificed everything for ideals that politicians barely understand, that kind of achievement doesn't fade just because bureaucrats decide it's inconvenient. Sarah's story reminds us that we live surrounded by invisible legend. The quiet woman at the grocery store might have diffused explosives in war zones. The unassuming man working construction might have extracted hostages from impossible situations. The reserved person serving your coffee might have made decisions that prevented international incidents. They don't wear their achievements like badges of honor, because true honor doesn't require recognition. They don't demand respect, because they've learned that respect given freely is worth more than respect extracted through displays of authority. But when circumstances force their true nature into the light, when a sleeve slides back to reveal faded ink, when instincts trained in combat zones become visible to observant eyes, when quiet competence is mistaken for weakness until it can no longer be contained, the revelation changes everything around them. The Rangers at Camp Valdez learned that strength comes in forms they'd never been trained to recognize. That courage often looks like calm compliance rather than aggressive confrontation. That the most accomplished warriors are usually the ones who've learned that boasting and bragging are luxuries that professionals can't afford. Sarah Chen walked onto that training ground as a contract and left as a teacher, not because she demanded recognition, but because circumstances forced the truth of who she was into daylight where it couldn't be ignored. She carried her tattoo not as proof of what she'd accomplished, but as evidence of what she'd lost and found again in the space between humiliation and respect. The ink meant everything and nothing. A piece of art that represented trials no one else could understand, sacrifices no one else had made, and achievements that would never appear in history books. True warriors